This is your read through with commentary of Act 1, Scene 3, starting with line 39. You will recall that we have already covered the beginning of Act 1, Scene 3 with the previous lesson where the witches are by themselves, and this introduces their reputation. So now we are finally ready to meet our title character, Macbeth, and his best friend, Banquo, a fellow captain. Both of these men were mentioned in Act 1, Scene 2 because they were the victorious captains in the battle that the Bleeding Captain talked about. And so we already know that they are war heroes. Macbeth's very first line in the play is important. He says, "So foul and fair a day I have not seen." So there's a line that we recognize, and we've already talked about it being an important theme in the play. Here, it doesn't really make sense. How can a day be both foul and fair? Macbeth is talking about two different things here. He is talking about how the battle went well for them. They were victorious, and so it was a fair victory. It was a good, positive victory, and he feels, of course, that the right side won. However, they have just walked into a very foul weathered area. It is gray and misty and probably cold. It is Scotland after all. And so he's saying this was a great day at battle, but the weather is terrible. And so he's establishing that juxtaposition, to use a big Englishy word for it, which just means a contrast. All right, so pay attention as we listen through this first part to how Macbeth responds to the witches and how Banquo responds to the witches. The witches are going to predict some things for both of the men, but of course they are said in the form of riddles, like witches often do.
So foul and fair a day I have not seen.
How far is called to forest? What are these? So withered and so wild in their attire that look not like the inhabitants of the earth, and yet are on't. Live you, or are you aught that man may question? You seem to understand me by each at once her choppy finger laying upon her skinny lips. You should be women, and yet your beards forbid me to interpret that you are so.
Speak, if you can. What are you?
Oh, hail, Macbeth. Hail to thee, Thane of Cawdor.
Oh, hail, Macbeth. Hail to thee, Thane of Cawdor.
Oh, hail, Macbeth, that shalt be king hereafter.
Good sir, why do you start and seem to fear things that do sound so fair? In the name of truth, are ye fantastical? Or that indeed which outwardly ye show? My noble partner you greet with present grace and great prediction of noble having and of royal hope, that he seems rapt withal. To me, you speak not. If you can look into the seeds of time and say which grain will grow and which will not, speak then to me, who neither beg nor fear your favors nor your hate.
Hail, hail. Lesser than Macbeth and greater.
Not so happy, yet much happier.
Thou shalt get kings, though thou be none. So all hail, Macbeth and Banquo. Banquo and Macbeth, all hail.
Stay, you imperfect speakers. Tell me more.
All right, I want to pause there before we move on. Macbeth has finally found his voice. And so before we see his reaction, let's look at Banquo's. So the witches make 3 predictions. I know you have a question on your MS form about why does Banquo doubt that they are women? So I was about to skip over that. But so he says that you should be women and yet your beards forbid me to interpret that you are so. This is a double-sided comment because we have to remember that in Shakespeare's original audience, all female roles were played by men. And so quite likely these were actual beards on men. And so it's kind of a joke at the fact that there are men on stage. But it also might just be a comment on the fact that these women are old, perhaps. You may know some old women with hairs on their chin. or just that they're not very attractive or they're very manly. But most likely it is an inside joke for the audience of the Shakespearean era that these roles are being played by men. So then they turn and they hail Macbeth, the Thane of Glamis, which it's important for you to know that Macbeth is the Thane of Glamis. That's his existing title. And the Thane of Cawdor is, so we talked about the word Thane, that a Thane is like a duke or an earl, or, he is a lord basically in Scotland. And so Glamis is the area that Macbeth currently rules because he is a lord. The witch then hails him Thane of Cawdor. This is a name that we have seen before. In Act 1, Scene 2, the Thane of Cawdor was a traitor who was executed or was going to be executed. He has not actually been executed yet. And Macbeth was responsible for defeating the Thane of Cawdor, but he doesn't know that Duncan has sentenced the Thane of Cawdor to death and that he has given him the title Thane of Cawdor. That is something that we saw happen in Act 1, Scene 2, but the characters don't know it yet. So I'm going to pause for a minute and let you turn and tell your wall or your dog or your mother what kind of irony that is. Did you say dramatic irony? If you did, you are correct. Congratulations. So we know something that Macbeth doesn't know at this point. Then he says, "All hail Macbeth that shall be king hereafter." This is the one that makes Macbeth, and you hear him on the audio, he just goes, "Oh!" And then Banquo begins to talk. So they just said all these great things to Macbeth, but the response comes from Banquo, who says two different things that let us as the audience know how Macbeth is responding to this good news. He says, "Good sir, why do you start and seem to fear?" Start is close to our word startle. And there's actually a word study here if you want to click and watch the video on your myshakespeare.com that explains that word. So Macbeth is startled and seems afraid. And then down here, he says, Macbeth seems rapt with all. It gives you the translation that rapt means entranced. He is shocked into silence. And he seems afraid. Maybe his facial expression, maybe his body language is the way an actor would bring that to clarity for an audience. So because Macbeth is so startled and quiet and standing over there, Banquo has an opportunity to talk to the witches. And so he starts just kind of asking them questions like he did about their beards. He says, are you fantastical or are you real? You've said all these great things. You have, with grace and great predictions of noble offices, royal hopes, greeted my partner. And then he says, but you don't speak any to me. He says, if you can look into the seeds of time, speak to me. He basically turns to him and goes, oh, hey, do me next, do my predictions. And so they do. They hail Banquo, also in a riddle-like fashion, lesser than Macbeth and greater, not so happy, yet much happier. And we could stop and pause and dig into those a little bit. But the most important one is this one. Thou shalt get kings, though thou be none. The word get is short for beget. And beget is a word that means to have children, to bear children. And if you click on this little conversation box up here, then you get that entire section translated. And so you can see that the My Shakespeare translation just says, your sons will be kings, though you will not. So they do have a prediction for Banquo, but it is that his sons will become king. And that becomes important later. All right, so now Macbeth has finally got his voice back. Let's find out what his response is. He says, stay and tell me more.
By Sinel's death, I know I'm Thane of Glamis, but how of Cawdor? The Thane of Cawdor lives, a prosperous gentleman. And to be king stands not within the prospect of belief, no more than to be Cawdor. Say from whence you owe this strange intelligence, or why upon this blasted heath you stop our way with such prophetic greeting. Speak, I charge you.
The earth hath bubbles as the water has, and these are of them. Whither are they vanished?
Into the air. And what seemed corporal, melted as breath into the wind. Would they had stayed.
Were such things here as we do speak about? Or have we eaten on the insane root that takes the reason prisoner?
Your children shall be kings.
You shall be king.
And Thane of Cawdor, too, went it not so?
To the self-same tune and words. Who's here?
The king hath happily received, Macbeth, the news of thy success.
I'm sorry, before Ross gets going, I want to point out a couple of lines in what he has to say so that you guys can follow his speech. And I also want to go back and talk about Macbeth's response here. So once he finally recovers from his shock or fear, he now has a lot of complaints. He has a lot of questions. He says, how could I possibly be the Thane of Cawdor? And to be king stands not within the prospect of belief. At this point, Macbeth just doubts them. He thinks they are making things up. He says, tell me why you know that. Or, tell me what you're doing here. And that's when they vanish. After the witches vanish, Banquo and Macbeth try to make sense of what they've just seen. Consider one of those times when you're with your friends and you just have no idea what just happened. It's kind of like at the end, or at the beginning rather, of Gawain and the Green Knight. After the Green Knight runs out of the banquet hall and Gawain and Arthur turn to each other and they just kind of laugh it off like, what in the world was that?